Hello and good afternoon. Today is the 25th of November 2017. My name is Will Greer and I am interviewing Sara Patenaude for the Women's March Oral History Project. How are you today, Sara?
I'm pretty great.
Excellent. So we start with just some background information. And so why don't you tell me what year you were born?
I was born in 1986.
Excellent. Okay, and where were you born?
I was born at the Carswell Joint Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas.
Well, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So 1986, you were born in Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. And in 2017, you are living here in Atlanta, Georgia. So what's the in-between there?
Well, I lived in Fort Worth my whole childhood and growing up. I actually graduated high school with a couple of people I started elementary school with. I have a friend that we went to school together all the way through kindergarten to 12th grade. But then after I turned 18, I fled the nest. And I first moved to Ohio. I did my undergrad at Northern Kentucky because they're right across the river. And then I started a master's degree at Washington State University. Hated it there. There was nothing there. It was an hour and a half from the nearest museum and also the nearest Indian food, which is unacceptable.
What was it, a master's in?
History.
Okay.
And so I did one semester there and then begged my way into the history program at UMBC in Baltimore.
Okay.
And so I moved across the country the other direction to Baltimore. I lived there for 2 years, finished my master's, and then came to Atlanta to start at Georgia State.
Okay. And what year did you start at Georgia State?
I started in January 2012.
Okay. So, growing up, your family, how would you describe their political leanings?
My mom is a donor to the Republican Party.
Okay.
My family is very, very conservative. My mother is actually the least conservative of my relatives, and yet she still gives to the Republican Party.
Okay.
So that tells you a little bit about how far to the right the others are. Yeah, my grandfather and I are Facebook friends now, which is very trying.
Okay.
We are very much on opposite ends of the spectrum.
I see. And where do most of them live?
They're almost all in Texas.
Okay.
Yeah, my mom's family, so my grandparents are both from Iowa, but then my grandfather was in the Air Force, which is how I ended up being born on an Air Force base.
Mm-hmm.
So they moved all over, but then by the time my mom was in high school, they settled in Fort Worth. And she and my uncle and his family and my grandparents all still live in Texas.
Oh, nice.
And my little brother.
Okay. What is your profession?
I am currently a PhD candidate at Georgia State in the history department. I also currently work for a development consulting firm. So I would say that my profession is the non-academic side of being an urban historian.
Okay. And so how would you describe being an urban historian?
Well, I would say that when you're looking at the academic side of an urban historian, you're looking at people who talk about patterns in development, both people and buildings, and kind of the life of cities and the people that live in them. And then the surrounding, we talk a lot about suburbs now, even in urban history. And then, so taking that out of the academic realm, I've worked for a city government and I'm currently working for a development firm trying to use what I know of history to make good cities in the future.
Oh, okay.
We'll see how well it works.
Well, I wish you luck on that. What political party do you support?
I am a very liberal Democrat.
Okay. So prior to the Women's March, were you ever involved in political activities?
Yes.
Okay, so like what did you do?
Well, let's see. So my first political activism would have been, I guess, 2010, 2011 with the Occupy movement.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of Occupy Baltimore.
Oh, great.
We had a big tent city set up in downtown Baltimore and I helped and donated and gave volunteer time to, there was an open kitchen where we'd make big meals and serve anybody who came. I ran a knitting circle. We taught people how to knit. Did a bunch of protests down there. And that was really the first real activism that I'd done. So I actually had been in high school during the beginning of the Iraq War and had made some political stands in a way back then. Because again, being in Texas, everybody was wearing those "Freedom Isn't Free" t-shirts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made my mom take me to the craft store and bought some puff paint and some stencils and made my own t-shirt.
Oh, what did it say?
It said, "We are not the world's police. Send our soldiers home."
Oh, nice.
I was not the most popular girl in my high school. So I had done that side of things. And then in, I guess it was 2013, 2014, I had gotten involved with more of the political side, not just the activism, but I had worked for a actually Republican state house campaign briefly. That crashed and burned. But then I was a fellow for the Carter for Governor campaign.
Oh, okay.
And so I had done a little bit of that, but then I got married and had my son and got away from it for a while. And so with the election last year, that really re-energized my desire to be active. So, yeah.
That's very cool. All right. So, did you participate in any marches or anything growing up? Or
Growing up, oh God, no.
Okay.
No, definitely not. No, my I would say my first marches were probably with Occupy Baltimore.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, why did you choose to march on January 21st, 2017?
It felt really important.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I remember hearing that the march was going to happen and feeling like it was absolutely vital to be part of it. Yeah, I didn't actually know that I was going to get to go up to DC, but I knew that even if I was here in Atlanta, that it needed to happen and it needed to be big. I had no idea how big it would be. I don't think anybody really knew. But yeah, it felt absolutely vital to be part of it.
Okay. And what was the issue that was most important to you?
Making a showing against Donald Trump.
Okay.
I mean, really at its basis, that is what it was about, was not necessarily any particular issue or any one catalyst thing. It was just that I know from politics in the past that whenever somebody gets elected, they consider it to be a mandate, right? That they're that they have a mandate from their supporters and they're going to do whatever. And of course, that's always a problem because, generally you're talking about maybe like 51% of voters, which are only so many percent of the people. And so at any given time, that's a really kind of misleading statement in the first place. But especially with Donald Trump, it felt like it was really important that people stand up and say, no, you don't have our support, you don't have a mandate, and you don't stand for the American people. So
could you articulate exactly what it was about him that you opposed?
Everything.
Okay.
I oppose his fiscal policies such as they are. I oppose his immigration policies that he's been trying to put into place. I oppose basically every single one of his campaign promises that he made at every single one of his rallies. Yeah, it's just across the board bad.
Okay. And what march did you attend?
I went up to DC.
Oh,
yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So
why did you choose to go up to DC?
I really wanted to be a part of something big. And by the time, by late December, everybody knew it was going to be big. And I had made plans with a friend that we were supposed to drive up together. And I have friends in Baltimore and DC to stay with. And so, I had actually I was going through my divorce at the time, and I didn't know what my custody was going to look like. So we didn't Like, I didn't know then if I was going to be able to go. I really wanted to, and it ended up that the way our custody worked out, that was the weekend my son was with his dad.
Oh, okay.
So it worked, right? Everything just lined up. And then my ride fell through.
Oh,
no. And so about, 10 days before the inauguration, my ride had fallen through. And there were a bunch of buses that went up from Atlanta. There was a whole fleet of buses that had been rented out and chartered out. And they opened up a couple of seats on some buses, and I snagged one.
Nice.
And so at the very last minute, that was probably a week before, I found out that not only was I able to go, but I was going to be taking a bus up.
So were you by yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't know anybody on my bus.
Oh, wow.
I knew a couple of other people that were going to be there, but I actually consciously did not make plans to meet up with anybody because I felt like if I was trying to find one person in a crowd that I was just going to disappoint myself. So I went up on my own to be part of this crazy kind of thrown together sisterhood of women that were on this bus.
Okay. So what issues did you see represented at the march when you were there?
Oh my goodness. There was a lot going on. Everything. It's kind of funny to look back on it now because of the things that have become bigger issues. Of course, Trump had been making his promises about the wall and the Muslim ban, and I don't think we realized how serious those were at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't remember seeing a lot of pro-immigration posters, but there was a lot of women's rights, abortion rights, gay rights, a lot of stuff just about democracy and freedom. Lots of people dressed as a Statue of Liberty. I saw several of those. A lot of people still holding pro-Hillary signs. It's kind of funny to think back about what we thought were going to be issues and the things that are issues now.
Yeah. So, what did you think were going to be, the issues that...
this sounds a little naive, but I thought he was just going to kind of throw his hands up and not really do anything. Not that it wasn't a problem, but I didn't expect him to actually try some of the crap that he's trying to pull. Like with the Muslim ban. I didn't think he was actually going to go through with it because it sounded so insane and unconstitutional. And that when I had already written it off as being ridiculous. I had no comprehension that we would be talking about nuclear war. That thought truly never had crossed my mind. And now it's a real fear. So, I knew some of the basics, right? I knew that there were going to be problems with race because of the things he had said in the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that there were going to be problems with abortion rights because, he ran as a far-right, pro-life person. I knew there were going to be issues with the Supreme Court justice, though I didn't, again, imagine that he would nominate somebody like Neil Gorsuch. I think we knew the broad strokes, right? We knew that there were going to be problems with race and gender, but not what the specifics would turn out to be.
Okay. So you didn't know anybody. And how long a bus ride was that?
Oh, man. Probably 10 or 12 hours.
So what was that like?
I slept a lot. I think our bus left at 6 or 7 p.m. and got there early in the morning. I actually ended up sitting next to a woman who works for the Agnes Scott alumni office.
Mm-hmm.
And she was active in the Cab Democrats or the Atlanta Democrats. And so we had a long conversation about how the political support parties had been working in Atlanta. And basically her point of view was that they weren't. That it must have been the DeKalb Democrats because I've met several people now who are involved with them. And she was like, it's all run by the old people and they don't understand what's going on. And, like they keep pushing out the young people who have ideas.
Right.
There was a lot of wine on the bus. I think we mostly kept that for the way back. But yeah, there were several boxes of wine flowing.
Okay.
Everybody was really, really excited and friendly. And yeah, there was so much energy, even though it was the middle of the night. And people were really kind and respectful.
So what were your feelings before, during, and after the march?
That's just a little question.
Just a little question. Let's start with before the march. I mean, you you just described this experience that was very friendly, very sisterly. Would I say?
Yeah.
And so then the bus gets there at 6, 7 in the morning. So how do you get to the march from there? What happens once?
Well, I remember when the sun was coming up and like all of a sudden the nerves started, I think, for everybody on the bus because we were stuck in traffic of all the other charter buses who were coming up for this thing. And I remember all of us being like, are we going to get there on time? Are we, is that going to happen? Are we going to be late? Are we going to, are we going to miss it? And so like the buildup of the nerves, like starting, and then all the buses had to park at RFK Stadium, which is probably a good 1.5 miles from the National Mall.
Okay.
And my plan, I had a Metro card because I've been up to DC before, but my plan was to walk. And so we got off the bus and I took a picture of where the bus was parked, thank God, because I still had managed to, I still got lost on the way back, but it worked out. But yeah, so then I just started following the line of women walking out of the stadium. And it was a line of women walking out of the stadium, walking to the mall. And I had brought my sign, but I had an extra piece of poster board and some markers because I had leftover poster board and I was like, I have to bring it. Like, surely somebody will need it, right? And so when I was walking somewhere in Capitol Hill, like right before I got to the mall, I ran into a woman and she and her, I guess, daughter were talking and they're like, oh, we should have brought a sign. And I was like, oh, wait. And so we stood there on the side of the sidewalk and I handed her my markers and they made themselves a sign. And
that's very cool.
And that was kind of the feeling of the place, right? It was like everybody was there to be with each other and to help each other. There were lots of people handing out snacks and waters. All the churches had their doors open for people to come use the bathroom, which I hadn't even thought about.
Yeah, wow.
Like the whole 1.5 miles, it was just like a stream of people. And as you got closer and closer to the mall, there were more and more people waving from their windows, standing on their porches. Like I remember like a whole string of houses that we passed that people were standing on the front porch drinking their cups of coffee and waving to the crowds. And I want to say there was somebody like telling you which way to go at one of the corners where you could turn. So they were like, go that way, go that way. And somehow I came up the back end of the Capitol building. And so I was standing right behind the Capitol and took pictures. And then I ended up, I don't really know how this is possible, but I ended up like 40 feet from the stage.
Oh, wow.
Off to the side. So I couldn't hear anything because I was at the wrong angle of the speakers. But I ended up like super, super close where you could actually see the people on the stage. And even then I didn't realize how huge it was, right? Like I knew that there were a lot of people, but I didn't realize the magnitude of the group that was there. And so it wasn't until actually I had got back and saw pictures that I realized how close I was. There's one picture I remember in particular because I was basically halfway between the stage and the American Indian Museum. And there was like a box truck and there's this photo and I was right behind the box truck. So you can't see me in the photo. But I was like, oh, holy crap, I was right there. I was right there. And there was like an electric energy through the whole place.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
How did that square with, like, I mean, expectations you had before the march? Or, I mean, what were you?
I tried to go into it without setting expectations very high.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, I was going alone and it was this, like huge thing and I had no idea how it was going to go. I kind of thought I would show up in March and then have time. So I had a friend of mine who had invited people to come back to her house on Capitol Hill and have coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And silly me thought that I would show up in March and then go to her house and then go back to the bus because the bus, we had to be there at 6 p.m. or something. And that did not happen. That did not happen. Yeah, so it was huge. It was absolutely huge. And in fact, so ever since I had my son, it's hard for me to stand still. I can walk a long distance, that's fine, but standing in one place without being able to move around, my back starts to hurt. And so I was standing there in that crowd, and it was packed. You could not move. And I couldn't really hear anything coming from the stage. And we were just standing there. And I remember people getting really annoyed that we were still standing there, come on, start the march. And so there kept being these cheers of start the march. And we could hear that they were saying something about it on the stage, but we couldn't really hear what it was. And of course, it turned out after the fact that they couldn't march because the entire march route was full of people. It was filled shoulder to shoulder with people. So they had to get permission from the DC police to let us march on a different street. And so finally they said okay, you can march. And it was just this stream of people a couple of blocks north to go march towards the Capitol. And I just remember being so relieved. I was oh, thank God. And just desperately wanting to sit down, and I couldn't. There was no space to sit. Because you were literally so crowded, you couldn't even sit on sit straight down.
Well, what did the sign that you had say?
So I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of the 60s anti-war protests, but there's this very famous image. It has a flower and it says "War is not good for children or other living things."
Okay.
And it's a crudely drawn flower, but it's always been one of my favorite anti-war posters. And so one side of my poster had that. I had drawn a picture of that flower, and I wrote, "Trump is not good for children or other living things."
Oh, nice.
And then the other side said, "A woman's place is in the resistance."
Well, what other signs did you see?
There were a lot of "I'm with her" signs with arrows pointing all over, which is actually pretty cool because then you could hold it up and you're "I'm with all of these women." One of my favorite signs, as we were marching, there was a guy standing up on a wall in, I don't know, something flamboyantly rainbow. And he had a tambourine and he was singing songs and holding a sign that said, "Don't underestimate a gay man with a tambourine." That was one of my favorites. But he was leading people in songs as they were walking by. There's a lot of just anti-Trump posters. That was really the main theme. Questions of democracy. There were a lot of puns on Putin. A lot of feminism signs. I saw several times ones with, is it the Audre Lorde quote, where it's, "If my feminism is not intersectional, then it is bullshit."
Oh, okay.
That was really impactful, I feel because there were so many white women at the march.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a white woman. And yet I was aware of how many white women were at this march. It was overwhelmingly white women. And especially since the news had come out fairly early before that 53% of white women voted for Trump. And so seeing all of these women, I had to kind of stop and question, did some of these women vote for Trump? How many of these women didn't vote at all?
Yeah.
What would it have been had all of these women voted against Trump? Would we be here? Yeah, so there was a lot of, they were just kind of, I don't want to say generically political, but very like high level anti-Trump. You know, not getting into specific issues really, but just like expressing resistance. That's really what it was. There are a lot of pink pussy hats. I had my pink pussy hat. I'm not ashamed. They've become kind of a divisive symbol right now in the activism world.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, because they are really closely correlated with white feminism.
Oh, I see.
Which is not a good thing. Because, again, they're primarily associated with this march that was primarily associated with a bunch of white middle-class women.
Right.
So, yeah. But I had my pussy hat. Lots of people did. I was happy for it.
That's very cool.
I had some snacks in my bag.
Oh,
that
nice.
was the other big thing, was they told you that you had to have a clear backpack, or like your bag had to be clear. And it turned out not to actually matter. I don't think they enforced it at all. But so Amazon sold out of all of the clear backpacks, and people were freaking out trying to get them. And I had a clear bag. Yeah.
So what were some of the chants you heard?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, start the march, but...
Yeah. Well, and then once everything started, I'm trying to remember what was specific to that march, because I've been to a lot of marches since now. I don't really remember.
Okay.
There was a lot of like, this is what democracy looks like.
Right.
I don't really remember. I know when we walked past the Trump Hotel, there were a whole lot of middle fingers being held up.
Ah.
A lot of middle fingers.
From the crowd?
Yeah.
Ah, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, it was like a wave, like, you know, like people stand up in the stadium to do the wave. It was like the wave of middle fingers.
Nice.
And then I marched all the way to the Washington Monument. Because they had blocked off. You could not even see the White House. You could not get anywhere close to the White House. You could they had a fence with guards, and you could kind of look through the trees and kind of see where the White House was. But that was the closest you could get.
Right.
And people had left their signs. They had lined their signs up along this fence, and it just is like this overwhelming wall of signs. And I debated leaving my sign, but then I decided I didn't want to have to worry about getting it back on the bus, so I left it.
There you go.
Yeah.
So you said you were about 40 feet away
from the stage. Yeah.
So who were the speakers that you got to see?
I mean, I honestly didn't hear any of the speakers.
Okay.
Madonna at one point had gotten up, and I didn't know it was Madonna, but she was saying "fuck Trump" and all of these things, and we were like, "Oh wow!"
Yeah.
Was not what we expected to hear. Yeah, honestly, I could not tell you who spoke. I mean, I could because I know after the fact, but it was essentially, kind of several hours of standing there hearing noise that you couldn't quite make out. So mostly it was short little conversations with the people around you.
Right.
And I did a lot of eavesdropping on other people's conversations. Yeah.
Did you hear anything interesting, or?
There was one woman who was terribly, terribly offended. I guess at one point an Indigenous woman was on the stage, which again, we couldn't hear what was being said. And it happened at the same time that one of the Start the March chants started up.
Oh.
And she was horribly offended that all of these white women were yelling to start the march over top of this Indigenous woman.
Okay.
Which is a totally,
I
think, legit complaint.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of conversations about hating Trump. That was kind of the flavor of the day.
Well, how about law enforcement? What of law enforcement did you see?
I mean, I saw lots of cops. Along the march route, there were a lot of cops. Along that wall or the fence, by the Washington Monument, but looking over towards the White House. There was not a heavy police presence by any means, but there was definitely police there. There were a lot of women that were giving them high fives and saying thank you, which again, from my work that I've done since in the activism world, I understand why that's troubling to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I was a little bit conscious of that at the time. I didn't want to give any high fives or any effusive praise, but I did appreciate that the police presence there was calm, which I think had a lot again to do with it being mostly middle-class white women.
Right.
That it was I know people have said like it was a peaceful march with no incidents, but it was. I think we can't take that on face value. There's a lot of reasons why there were no incidents. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the actions of the protesters. But yeah, so that was good. And especially because the day before, I know there had been rioting and looting and problems. So I was aware of that and a little bit nervous, but then nothing happened.
So how about opposition protesters? Did you see any?
I didn't see a single one.
Huh.
No, not a single one. It was funny after the fact, again, like after we got back and we heard Trump talking about his inauguration crowd and how much bigger it was than the march crowd, and like there were all the bleachers still up along the route, and a lot of people had like stopped there to take breaks. So like even as we were marching through the bleachers, it was just like people waving and yelling, and yeah, I take that back. There was a guy on the balcony of the museum who was yelling something, and we couldn't quite hear what he was yelling. And so everybody was just like smiling and waving as we walked by. So I think I saw one.
Okay.
But I don't know what he was saying. Probably "Make America Great Again."
No, there you
certainly.
go. So, what did you think about coverage of the march that you saw in the media?
I thought it was great. I mean, it got wrapped up in that whole ego-driven thing that Trump tried to do about his inauguration march.
Right.
But what was, I think, really great about it was I don't think any of us realized not only how big the march in Washington was going to be, but how big it would be in the other cities. Because I have friends across the country. And every single one of them that went to a march said it was bigger than they expected. And just like seeing these massive crowds of people who were literally out there on the streets was phenomenal. So yes, I think the media did a good job of showing how big it was, how many people were there. And it was bigger than any of us expected it to be.
Okay. So you were by yourself. Did you pick up with a group of people, or did you just?
No, not really. I ended up, so at the end of the day, we marched and rallied and all of that, and I was starving because I had brought snacks, but like I was starving.
Right.
And I stood in the line that was probably half a block long to get to the hot dog stand.
Oh, wow.
Because everybody was starving. And I started talking to a girl and her mom that were standing in front of me. And I mean, we were probably in that line for half an hour. I know there was no like specific group that I caught up with or started talking to. I guess I was a lone bird for most of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, were there any other moments that really stood out to you, or?
I remember, so I've been to DC since, right? Like I've been up there a couple of times since. And like that march that we took, like I remember in particular marching past the EPA building, and I don't know why that, like I noticed that when it was happening, like why the EPA building stood out to me. But the last time I was up in DC at the beginning of this month, November, I happened to walk past the EPA building, and I was like, whoa, I was here. I was here, and I was part of this. And I think that that's really the feeling that I kept having during the day, was just like, I'm here. I'm really here, and I'm really part of this. So even though I was by myself and, like internally processing a lot of things that probably would have been more fun to deal with, like, with somebody there with me, it felt like being part of something big.
Yeah. Well, what was the most emotional moment for you?
I don't think it actually came until the end.
Okay.
Because during the day, it was just like, there was so much happening. Even when we were like just standing there and we couldn't really hear what was happening, it was still like the emotions were so high and so heightened and kind of overwhelming with what was going on. And especially when marching, and even though I can't remember what we were chanting, I know I chanted the entire, what mile, 2 miles, I don't remember. But then at the end of it, I was around the Washington Monument for a while with a bunch of folks, and I stood in line for a half hour to get my hot dog. I sat down for the only time the whole day to sit on a bench and eat my hot dog. But then I had to walk back to the stadium. I mean, I could have taken a picture, but I was walking back to the stadium, and my legs were killing me. They were so tired. I was exhausted. I realized I hadn't peed all day long. Like, I literally had not gone to the bathroom because I just hadn't stopped to do it. And that walk back, like, and watching these groups of women walk back to the stadium for their buses, it was just like, wow. I mean, a lot of why I wanted to go to DC in particular was because, there's always this sense when you're looking in the history books and you read these stories about, the million people that show up for this, or the 100,000 people that went to that. And it's always been so distant. Like, it's a number. It's a number in a history book. And so realizing all of a sudden that I was now one of those numbers, that someday people are going to be reading a history book and it's going to have a number in there and I'm going to be one of the people counted, is really phenomenal, and a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
But and not specific just to that march, but with everything in the last year, these are historic times. That's the feeling that I keep having over and over. But not just historic because they're going to make future history, but historic because they're so reminiscent of battles that we've had in the past. And especially as somebody who taught freshman college students for years, every college student thinks they know what they would do if they were alive during slavery or they were alive during the civil rights movement. And they always think, like, if I had been a slave, I would have run away. Or if I had been in the civil rights movement, I would be a freedom rider. And I think that's totally normal.
Well, sure.
Totally normal. So the thing that I think has really guided me through this last year is to stop and ask myself, like, how do I want to look back on this? What do I want to remember? Who do I want to have been? And that's really what that felt like. Was like going. Going was who I wanted to be. I wanted to be a person that had gone to that march.
What was the ride back home like?
It was awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, we were all exhausted. All of us, every single one was exhausted, and there were at least 2 boxes of wine being passed around. And we had little plastic cups, and literally we were all sitting in the seats of the charter bus, and the box of wine was passed back and then back up and then back, and people were just laughing and talking and sharing stories for hours. I mean, because we were like exhausted, but also completely revved up. Yeah, I mean, we got home early in the morning. I want to say we got back at like 5 a.m. So I want to think like Sandy Springs or Marietta or somewhere, and I had parked my car and had to drive back and being so tired. But I think we were all just exuberant with having been there.
So how did your friends and families and colleagues respond to the fact that you marched?
My friends and my colleagues thought it was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I had a few friends that went up to DC, a couple that flew, a couple that took other buses, a lot that live in Baltimore, so they were able to just come down. And so even though I didn't actually meet up with any of them on the day, it all felt like we had been part of something together.
Mm-hmm.
And like, even though we didn't literally share the experience at that moment, we shared it afterwards and talking and like connecting over it. As far as I know, I was the only history grad student that actually went up to DC.
Okay.
I know a lot of them marched in Atlanta, but I'm pretty sure I was the only one that actually got to go up to DC. Or at least of the cohort that I know. And so there were a lot of questions afterwards of how it went and what I thought. My mom was very kind. I think she was supportive. I don't know if she voted for Trump, despite being a Republican, because she is sensitive to things like women's rights and, like bodily autonomy. She's not necessarily pro-choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's more pro-choice than she realizes, but she's not anti-abortion.
I see.
My stepfather, though, is a Trump supporter still.
Right.
And so my mother warned me that I was not allowed to argue with him about it. Not that I was supposed to hide it or anything, which is good because he and I are Facebook friends. But I think my mom was nervous about how my other family members would react. And really, if they were saying anything, it was behind my back and I didn't hear it. So,
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I will ask you this then. How have you been feeling since the march?
Things are so much worse than we expected.
Okay.
Truly. I don't think any of us were truly prepared for the president that we have.
Okay.
So I remember 2016 was a really hard year for me. It was a bad year. I was getting divorced and there was lots of drama and it was a really bad year. And I remember actually standing up at Quaker meeting. I don't remember if it was on January 1st or the first meeting of the new year, what it was. But I remember standing up and saying, look, guys, we made it. We're in 2017. It's going to be okay. 2017, even though my personal life is much, much better, it feels like the world has fallen apart and that we are only holding it together by the skin of our teeth. I don't think any of us were prepared to be concerned about a nuclear war with North Korea. I don't think any of us were prepared to have multiple Muslim bans that were tried to put into place, to lose DACA, to have a president that actively advocates for police brutality, to have a pedophile running for Senate. None of us were prepared for this. The good thing that has come of it is that people are engaged, and that includes me, right? Yeah. Like I'd fallen off. Not that I didn't care, but it felt like things were getting better, and so I didn't need to be the one out there doing it. I didn't need to be the one running things and trying to make them happen because it felt like just the world was getting a little bit better. I'm like, okay, we're doing all right. I've realized how fragile that was and how it's only by all of us keeping working, even when things feel all right, that we're going to be able to hold on to the gains that we've had. And a lot of people have stepped up for that. A lot of people. And a lot of them are imperfect. I'm in a couple of groups with white middle-class women from Cobb County, and they're occasionally infuriating. But you also have to stop to remember that there are a lot of women who weren't politically active a year ago. And I think it's only through that kind of change in our society that we're going to be able to avoid more of this happening. You know, we've already got the President Trump, hopefully not for 3.5 more years, or, 3 years and some months. I'm hoping that we won't have to get to the end of that. But I feel like we can make it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to get that?
I'm ringing. No, I'll be fine.
Okay. So what do you hope will happen?
Realistically?
However you want to articulate it.
What do I hope will happen? I hope we'll keep fighting. I hope... Oh, there you go. I hope that this is not just a reaction to President Trump, but that it's a realization of what we were taking for granted.
Okay.
So I hope that no matter what happens with impeachment, or, it would be fully in keeping with President Trump for him to just quit one day. I don't know what's going to happen politically, but what I do hope is that this has encouraged another generation of activism. And from what I've seen over the last 11 months, that's true. I think a lot of people were afraid with the Women's March, including myself, that this was going to be one thing. We were going to march, and then we were going to give up. And I think that easily could have happened. It's happened a lot before, where people give it one shot and then nothing changes, and so they stop trying. But that hasn't happened. People are still showing up. People are still pushing back. People are, winning elections that we never thought they could win. So I'm hopeful for that to continue.
Right. So how about maintaining momentum?
As long as President Trump keeps doing what he's doing, we're going to have momentum. I mean, that's the kind of that silver lining of all the terrible things he does, is that he keeps doing so many new and outrageous things that people keep reacting to it.
Well, do you have ways to, like, suggestions or strategies for people to cope with living?
I wish I knew, because I could use some strategies to cope. We just got to keep trying. I mean, I think especially with these special elections that we just had, with the midterms coming up next year, that there is enough happening to feel like we're making progress and making a difference. And I think that that's really the key to keep people active, right? You have to feel like you've been making a difference. Because if you keep doing things and nothing's happening, it's really easy to burn out. I'm really encouraged by all these indivisible groups that popped up, because they are the liberal version of the Tea Party, but the Tea Party was really, really successful.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful with that.
Sure.
I don't think this is going away anytime soon, which is both unfortunate because I don't think President Trump is going away anytime soon. My hope is that we're going to see a backlash to President Trump as strong as we had seen to President Obama, right? President Obama was so abhorrent to so many people on the right that we got President Trump. And we know that all of that is racially motivated, and it's awful racism and prejudicial, and then the backlash to Hillary.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have a truly terrible person in the highest office in our country. And I think that there's going to be a backlash to that too. And I hope that that's going to be a pendulum swing that stays rather than just going right back again. But I'm hopeful.
Well, on that note, unless there are any other final thoughts you have.
No, I'm just really glad I went I have not regretted that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting your time, offering your time and your voice to this.
You're
project.
very welcome. Thanks for letting me rant on about current politics too.
Oh, it was enjoyable. Thanks.